fair that there's generally considered to be a problem with boys when it comes to English?
Well, I suppose if it's there in actuality, then it should be treated as a problem and, you know, steps taken. But I sort of wonder where it comes from. It seems a bit sad if boys, you know, suddenly see themselves as being less able.
Do you think is that your perception as a parent of a boy? That they do fall behind girls?
It didn't seem an issue with him in particular, but I do feel it kind of sets in at some point after the, you know, at primary school. It seems to be, you know, the later years of primary school, and it suddenly sets in. The girls suddenly seem to be reading better. Do you think it's important that parents do know there's a potential difference, or should we all just be a bit more laid back about it and let them develop at their own paces and not worry so much that boys might be falling behind?
Yeah, I mean, you can set yourself up for self-fulfilling prophecy if you say, oh, well, you know, boys are no good at reading, then you're either then going to be overly sensitive to looking for a problem and finding it. You know, you might be less encouraging.
Bill, why do you think there is an issue with boys?
Well, there is a real issue, and I think it's related to the physiology of the brain. It's one factor, and the development of language skills by boys at an earlier age. But I also think it is to do with the fact that boys like action.
And did you think that role play example was a good way to get boys interested, or was that more to do with speaking and listening? I wasn't quite clear whether it was writing, reading, or speaking.
It's everything. That was a wonderful illustration of how all those elements are brought together to form a very realistic and appropriate learning experience for boys and girls.
Did you think that was good, Stephen, the role play, getting the boys to speak?
Yeah, it seemed to energise them, and they didn't seem at all self-conscious about it. And it did seem to work.
Bill raised an interesting point about boys and the action thing. Yeah. I mean, they do, without falling into sort of stereotypes, they do tend to be much more physical, especially small boys.
Yeah.
And often it's hard to focus them on activities that involve sitting and listening.
One thing about literacy is that we're in danger of over-romanticising the value of literacy for literacy's sake, because it's only a tool, really, isn't it? It's reading and writing, which you have to learn to do, because otherwise you can't do anything. And that's what that clip seemed to be about. It was saying, let's not call it literacy, let's not call it, you know, reading and writing. Let's say we're going to do this, but in order to do that, you do have to sit down and write this down and read this and assimilate this information.
OK, well, obviously functional literacy is important, but numeracy is equally important. And next we're going to travel to Jersey and Janvin's school, where they've developed a technique for teaching fractions using paper cups. In the clip, we see Louise Isaacs and her Year 3 class. They've decided that the multiplication sign should be called Love That Number.
Lauren, I'd like Jay to love that number 3 times. Good. How many times have you been so far, Jay?
Twice.
Twice, excellent. How many times left to go?
Once.
One more. OK. So, Jay, can you count them for me, please? Good, I'm really impressed. As I'm talking, everybody else is getting on with writing this math story. When you've written this math story, watch what Jay is doing.
With this type of approach, everybody can hang their hat on some sort of hook, and doesn't matter how they view those cups, it's a very vivid memory that allows them to sort of move on to the next part of the lesson, even if it's not that day, it could be later that week or even later that term.
Next, representing fractions with cards. But first, is there evidence that the teaching method is working?
Well, I'm in the business of trying to raise standards, obviously, and I found that mathematics has been very resistant to the standards being raised. So given that, we've been looking at other styles of techniques, and we're finding that this particular style here has been working really well.
We're going to use something that isn't cups, but it represents cups. So we have to imagine that we're using the cups this time, although they don't look like cups. But I need somebody who's feeling particularly brave to come and show us this math story using their fraction cards. Oh, come on then, Patrick, out you come.
Amanda, were you impressed with that way of teaching fractions?
I loved that. I could have watched that all day. It was fascinating because I remember learning fractions about 3 different times and never quite getting the hang of it. So I'd have loved to be able to do it like that. I thought it was brilliant. Just so simple.
Stephen, would that have helped you learn fractions, do you think, in your school days?
Yeah, I think we missed out all the stages, and it was just on the board, and it's kind of, it gets away from that abstract thing of, you know, plus and equal and division, and just does it in terms of physical objects and actually moving them from one table to another.
Do you think that for some parents it might seem too simplistic to be doing it with a lot of cups? They might really want their children to be sitting down learning hundreds of fractions. Have you experienced that as a former head?
Yes, indeed, I have. And it's at the very early stages of my career, parents would judge the competence of the teacher by the amount of maths in the books and the amount of books that their children filled in the course of a year. That's changed considerably. And often today, children may record very little in a maths lesson in the form of written work, but actually have engaged in really practical mathematical experiences which they will remember and which they will then be able to apply to simple recording, group recording as a whole class, as a small group, in pairs, and then on their own. And we should encourage that kind of teaching, particularly the kind of practical work that's there, because it actually leads to real understanding, and the gaps that we've experienced in our lives hopefully will not occur in the future.
That's a very interesting, important concept for parents to understand. I mean, do you ever have moments of panic and think, why aren't they doing their rote learning of the times tables?
I think you can get too worked up about it. Really, I don't really see how the schools, or why the schools should have to actively re-educate the parents. I mean, it's up to the parents to either look back a few pages if they really don't know how to do it.
Yeah.
I mean, the schools have got enough to do without re-teaching parents long division. I mean, they
Steve, would you be there on a wet Wednesday to do your long division class?
I was given the opportunity and I didn't go, so I can't.
Have you sneaked into the W.H. Smith's to buy a,
I
crib
have
book
been
off the shelf?
reading these little books that they bring home, the sort of work through books. And,
so you're satisfied that they are getting their entitlement to the sort of basic mathematical concepts?
I got a bit anxious about this thing about the times table, learning that by rote, because it seemed to me to be so useful, and they're obviously struggling, trying to work out 4 times 7 by adding 7 lots of 4 together, and it just seemed more useful to have it at the, know it by rote. And
okay, Bill, to defend the progressive methods of teaching maths, do you think we need to rote learn to?
I do. I think I actually think that there is to rote learn with understanding of what you are actually repeating, and I think that's the key.
In the next clip from Tayfant Community School in Bristol, we see Year 4 teacher Simon Mills teaching maths using computers. His first problem, though, is to stop the children eating the data.
I think the challenge in mathematics generally is the language. I think what's really important is for children to be able to talk about and use the language, because I don't think children are actually able to understand fully what the terms mean until they've had a chance to use it in conversation and to come to some kind of agreement themselves about what it means. ICT I see as a tool, it's a mediating tool, and it's also something that allows the children to see results quickly. It allows you to do things that you probably wouldn't get done normally. And one of the things that young children particularly find difficult with data handling is creating the charts themselves. The computer produces those for them, so straight away they're able to access the maths and they're not worried about presentation.
Okay, well, let's have you on the carpet. The children have used the ICT suite before, but this is the first time they've come across this piece of software.
0. Quickly before we go, put your hand up if you had exactly the same frequency of sweets inside your tubes. Nobody?
It'd be impossible if you wanted it to be equal.
It'd be impossible to have them all equal. Why do you think that?
Because you can't just get like 5 reds and 5 blues.
So you think from the data we've got already, you think it's impossible?
Yeah.
Amanda, that's a different way of teaching maths using ICT. Did you feel maybe it was too much about the ICT and not enough about the maths, or did you think the balance was about right?
It doesn't really matter, I suppose, because they've obviously got a huge level of skill in the ICT, and then the maths seem to be being absorbed along, you know, in the whole process of it. So I'm not sure where the division lay, but they seem to be pretty good at both by the end of it.
Does it worry you, though, Stephen, those children haven't got the required ICT skills? They might not be able to access their entitled curriculum.
Yeah, I did get the impression that it was a bit chaotic in parts, that lesson, and there's, I suppose the children were helping one another, but they did seem groups that you know, were really struggling, and that they, you know, it was acting as a barrier to them understanding the maths, the fact that they, you know, they couldn't open Excel, or they'd lost their data, or they, you know, they couldn't work out how to do the different colours, and it did seem to be creating more difficulties. I don't know what the balance was, whether it, because I know it's very fiddly to do it by hand as well.
Well, we do know, don't we, that there is an issue about some non-specialist ICT teachers using computers in the classroom and maybe not feeling confident themselves about it. Do you think that can be a problem?
I think that particular clip, if we reflect on what that clip, it was about exposure of those children to that software for the very first time. Inevitably, some children are going to struggle. And that's part of the assessment process for that teacher. And I believe, and I would hope, that teacher, following that lesson, would identify the children who were struggling and actually enable them, by perhaps pairing them with another child, to gain those skills.
Stephen, what do you think about the idea of more able pupils helping the less able? Does that bother you as a parent, or do you think that's a kind of nice thing for them to do?
No, I think it should be encouraged, because they gain more confidence in their own ability, and it's what happens in life outside school. People help one another, and I don't think there should be this idea of you know, children keeping their skills to themselves and sort of, you know, being in a state of rivalry with other children and competitive with them.
This is all about a totally different sort of classroom management to the one that we had. How do you think parents can be confident that that really is raising standards when the same message you're getting all the time as well is they should all be sitting in rows and looking at a blackboard at the front? There is a school of thought.
Is that the message you're
getting? I
getting?
think there is, in the media, there is a message that we ought to go back to more traditional methods of teaching.
What we saw there was, in effect, good social development of children, as well as good intellectual development of children. And I think that for formality to be increased would actually work against children and their ability to develop those key social and skills of good citizenship too.
OK, well, I think most parents would agree with that comment, but we have to end it there. You can have your say, though, by emailing parents@teachers.tv, and you can find all the information about programmes you have seen and more on our website at Teachers TV. Details at the end of the programme. Thanks to my guests, Amanda, Stephen and Bill.
Goodbye.
And from myself, Fiona Miller. Thanks for joining us, and until next time, goodbye.